Lads and ladies, it's Roy Livy here, and it's no secret that after the Stellar Knights set concludes, the World Cup set will arrive. It doesn't take a rocket surgeon to figure that one out. Even more so that Sorare CEO NJ has gone fast and loose with his tweets essentially confirming that will be the case. So I'm already thinking ahead to that game mode, especially as a free-to-play sets player, and almost breaking down how to best approach this World Cup sets mode come June when it arrives. You know, assuming Trump doesn't nuke the entire planet within the next 2 months, which you probably can't completely rule out, but hopefully we'll be playing a World Cup set mode in June. And that's because Stellar Knights ends June the 2nd, I believe, with the World Cup kicking off on the 11th of June, which is a Thursday. So you imagine the World Cup set will have to drop either the weekend before or at the very latest by the 9th of June on the Tuesday, as you do need a few days in advance to start grabbing players and such. And the World Cup set will be slightly different in comparison to the Winter and Stellar sets, with the breakup of international fixture spread across the group stages and, you know, later knockout rounds. So it will likely be a slower burn up the ladder on the board, that is, than what is possible currently, especially if you don't pack enough players from nations, you know, that start the first couple of games and such. You could immediately find yourself a bit behind the curve. Whether Sorare have thought about this and, you know, certain pack weights and special packs on offer to counteract this, but we have to imagine it will be mostly similar to what the current set's setup is right now, as that has clearly gone quite well from Sorare's point of view. Now, I will say in terms of point scoring on the sets board, there is probably more of an edge early on into the World Cup as well, which could be a big factor in the need or use of spending gems early if you're going to do so. I wonder if managers and even Sorare themselves have factored this in as a thought once more. And what I mean by this is that not only does it make sense to spend your gems early on into the sets board if you did plan on spending, and that's just from a basic standpoint, right, as you give yourself the most time and matches to extract value for money back from your pack pools in terms of winning future gems and future cash on the board and so on. But I'm also talking about it making the most sense in terms of the World Cup as a competition in general and the fixture list that comes with it. Because naturally, as the tournament progresses, the cream of the crop will pull through and you'll start seeing those more competitive matchups occur in the later knockout stages. And you then have to consider how much more difficult that will make hitting those later stages of the World Cup sets board, you know, in terms of requiring an increased points total to do so. And that's because those tougher fixture matchups will naturally make it more difficult and limiting for those individual players to score points in So 5. Let's look at Brazil, for example. You know, they could have to face the likes of England and Germany in the quarterfinals should things go as expected. England or Germany, not both at the same time, that is. And then maybe even France or Argentina and so forth to come after that in the semis and finals. So obviously you would expect those to be closer games, tougher games for both teams involved, competitive matches, so to speak, which will make it harder for the individual players starting in those matches to score points on So 5. I think that all makes sense. I'm sure you're with me so far. So while you may pack a bunch of the top players early on from these big nations, these elite players are all likely to be playing each other come the final weeks of the tournament, and taking and morphing the old adage from the Incredibles, if everybody is elite in a Sorare matchup, then nobody is. But this is where we can obviously caveat that back completely the other way, flip that 180, because early on in the tournament for the group stages, again, if we look at Brazil here as an example, they're in a group with Morocco, Scotland and Haiti. Now, Morocco are certainly no pushovers after coming both first and second in the AFCON earlier this year. But, you know, you think about Brazil against Scotland, and more specifically Brazil against Haiti, and they could go on an absolute tear there. I'm talking cricket scores on the football pitch. Let's even just say a 5-0 win for Brazil, which I don't think anyone would say is unfair to predict, even if I am perhaps being a bit harsh on Haiti. They have earned their place in this World Cup on merit, so clearly they aren't terrible by any stretch, but I do think most people will probably be backing Brazil in that fixture. So those starting 11 players for Brazil could all net incredible scores on So 5 if they play in tandem with each other, which likely wouldn't be as possible in the later stages of the tournament against a France or a Germany, for example. So hitting streaks on the sets board, in theory, should be easier at the start of the tournament with these more favourable fixture matchups, assuming you manage to pack the right players. And you then can't even argue about Brazil potentially resting key players for the Haiti matchup, you know, maybe saving them for later knockout matches, because in sets, you can select your team after seeing the lineups to avoid DMPs. So even those bit part 1-star and 2-star players for Brazil who may get a surprise start in a fixture against Haiti can suddenly become very powerful assets. All of this to say that I actually think World Cup sets will have a bigger gulf or disparity in matchups when you compare it to previous sets, the Winter and Stellar Knight sets. PSG, Man City and so forth from the current sets are certainly favourites and heavy hitters in a lot of matchups currently, but I still don't think that quite compares to Spain against Cape Verde or Germany against Curacao, with all due respect to those nations. So my simple advice would be, if you're going to spend gems, make sure you do so immediately at the start of the sets right before the first matchups, and then stop or limit your spending on gems as the tournament goes on and they intrinsically become less valuable as consumables, or maybe only buy them if you have a shot at improving your lineups for a chance at $100 or $1,000, but that's sort of your decision at that point. So I think a lot of it will depend on whether Sorare plan on starting the World Cup sets differently this time around. But the last two sets, you had a choice of picking a starter club, essentially, which guaranteed you some players from that club. I think for Stellar Knights, I went with Man City and got a 3-star Bernardo Silva, so we have to assume Sorare probably aren't going to deviate too far from that, and they're going to let you pick a starter nation for the World Cup sets. And I think it could be quite important to know which nation is likely the best to go for based on the fixture list of the group stage. So let's take a look at the big nations and see who the best option could be. So of course we've looked at Brazil, who I think are going to be a strong choice right off the bat if you can secure a few of their starting players. As mentioned, Morocco is a tough fixture to begin with, but you also have to factor at what point these big nations have their hardest group game. So Brazil's toughest group game, as we've just said, is going to be their first game against Morocco, which is only 2 days into the World Cup tournament. So while it may be, a tough game and you might not expect as high SO5 scores from your players, 2 days into the World Cup set, you're likely only going to be on stage 2 or stage 3 of the board, especially if you're coming in from a free-to-play angle. So if anything, getting their hardest fixture out of the way first is actually favourable if you're running a Brazil stack, as it means you still have a good shot of hitting those early streaks on the board where less points are needed, and you save the higher SO5 ceiling fixtures for later on where you can hopefully be pushing for a higher streak, streak 4, 5, or maybe even streak 6. Basically, a Brazil stack against Haiti would almost feel like a waste on stage 1 of the board, but could be super optimal on stage 5 or 6 if you can get there in time. So Brazil is a strong pick for a nation to build around. Now some other major nations, keeping it South American with Argentina, and they have a great matchup against Jordan for the final group stage fixture, but I in general feel like Algeria and Austria could be more tricky for them and throw a spanner in the works. So I think by the time the Jordan fixture rolls around, you almost are better off just hoping you've naturally packed a few Argentina starters from the daily packs. Spain are, of course, going to be a strong pick in any case, but playing Cape Verde as their first game in what is their best fixture matchup is, a bit grim in terms of what we just spoke about with the board. Same with Germany facing Curacao on match 1, so I'm probably going to avoid both of them as a starter nation. I do think England themselves, ourselves, could be a decent pick, despite the weak performances in the final friendlies before the World Cup. Even, looking at Croatia as the first game, if we can avoid a humbling there, it's then 2 favourable fixtures against Ghana and Panama, which you'd probably have to back England on. Although you do have to keep in mind England are in the final group, Group L that is, meaning our fixtures take place last during the group stages in terms of time, and the date they kick off. So you don't want to miss out on too much value by not having enough players from groups and matches that are playing earlier on in the tournament, as of course if you can hit stage 1 and stage 2 on the board more immediately at the start, like June the 12th instead of June the 15th, that's going to be some extra essence you secure along the way to help you improve your count earlier and really kick things off as you want to go on with the World Cup sets. All of this to say that I think I'm going to go for Brazil when it comes to my starter nation pick. So as we said, there's just under 2 months left of Stellar Knights, so plenty of time to farm gems from the mode to carry over into the World Cup set, because we could carry gems over from Winter into Stellar Knights, remember. So for anyone doing well in Stellar Knights right now, I'd already consider holding on to your gems you win from now onwards to use in the World Cup set. That's my plan anyway, although I'm not usually the most smart guy, so treat that as you will. We just have to hope Sorare don't plan on putting a stop on carrying gems over from one set to another, as that would severely hinder the value of gems in my eyes. It would truly make them a limited, time consumable, only valuable for one set at a time, essentially devaluing them at the later stages of a set, assuming you couldn't carry them over into the following one, because what good is winning 50 gems on a set when there's like 2 days left of the set itself? Do you see what I'm saying? You almost have to be able to carry them over. Whether they put a cap on the allowed amount to carry over or convert it somehow like Essence, I could see being possible, but I think that part of the money you spend on Stellar Knights has to be done with a forethought of spending on future sets as well, such as a World Cup set. And even, let's just say I won $100 from Stellar Knights Stage 5. Of course my $100 would carry over, so why shouldn't my gems carry over at the same time? Do you see what I'm saying? Maybe Sorare have painted themselves into a metaphorical corner with that one. I think it would be almost too late to make an announcement and change anything in regards of gem carryover for the World Cup sets. It would be unfair on the people who have spent actual cold hard cash money on Stellar Knights. But of course, this is all speculative. Sorare themselves haven't mentioned anything about limiting the carryover of gems, so I'm just putting words in the horse's mouth. Not that horses can talk, but this Sorare horse can talk. I just think, you know, Sorare always sort of have these things in their mind a couple of months after the fact. You know, they only sort of mentioned reducing limited and rare and all of the normal essence carryover in the regular pro mode about halfway into last season. Do you know what I mean? So they like to leave things late. So hopefully there's not going to be a sneaky announcement anywhere in the coming weeks about this. So we're thinking of the World Cup set. I'm going to be looking into the best ways to farm gems, even from a free-to-play perspective, in a future video coming on the channel. So stick around until then. But until then, I'll catch you next time because I love you.